The courtroom fell into a heavy silence. Every eye was fixed on the man at the defendant's table, his hands trembling ever so slightly as the judge cleared his throat. Judge Caprio's gaze softened, but his voice was firm. "Mr. Lawson, the law is clear. Reckless endangerment cannot be excused by good intentions." The crowd gasped as the fine was announced. $200 million. The defendant's jaw tightened, and then, with a calm unlike anyone expected, he revealed a truth so profound it left the courtroom stunned. A truth that would change how everyone saw justice that day. Stay with us, and don't forget to share where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss a moment in this courtroom. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom groaned as they swung open, their deep, echoing creak momentarily halting the quiet murmurs that floated among the gallery. All heads turned toward the source of the sound. There, in the doorway, stood Thomas Lawson. He wasn't what most people would have expected. At the center of a case involving an astronomical $200 million in alleged damages, many had envisioned someone formidable, perhaps a sharp-suited executive with slicked-back hair and a practiced expression of detached indifference. Instead, Thomas looked every bit the reluctant participant. He was a middle-aged man with laugh lines etched around his eyes and silver strands streaking through his otherwise dark hair. His jacket was rumpled and clearly well worn, the elbows showing signs of fraying. A pair of faded jeans, softened by years of wear, completed the outfit. He looked less like a high-profile defendant and more like someone you might call to help fix a broken fence or patch a leaky sink. As he entered the room, Thomas hesitated for just a moment, glancing around with an expression of quiet discomfort. He stepped forward slowly, as if every stride toward the defendant's table brought with it the weight of anxiety and disbelief. The courtroom, packed with legal observers, journalists, and a smattering of curious locals, seemed to lean in ever so slightly, as though trying to get a better read on this unlikely figure. Thomas gave a shy nod to the bailiff, who acknowledged him with a subtle gesture of familiarity. Perhaps they'd met before, perhaps in the hallway during pre-trial procedures. Then, he turned his attention to the bench, where Judge Frank Caprio presided with his signature calm and compassionate demeanor. Their eyes met briefly. The judge gave a small, reassuring smile, the kind that suggested this wasn't just about legal protocol, but about people. People with stories, with flaws, with reasons worth hearing. Thomas seemed to take a little comfort from the judge's presence. He settled into his chair, shifting awkwardly and adjusting his jacket, as if trying to make himself smaller, less conspicuous. The court clerk shuffled papers, and for a moment, the only sounds were the rustle of documents and the quiet whir of the ceiling fan above. Finally, Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly and said, "Mr. Lawson, welcome. Please state your name for the record." Thomas cleared his throat, his voice slightly raspy. "Thomas Lawson," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "But most folks just call me Tom." The judge raised an eyebrow, amused. "All right, Tom. And are you aware of the charges being brought against you today?" Tom nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm aware. Though, to be honest, the number still sounds like a mistake. $200 million. That's more money than I've ever even imagined." A soft chuckle rippled through the courtroom, breaking the ice. It was an absurd amount, especially given the man sitting before them. Even the stenographer, usually stoic and unshaken, seemed to smirk slightly. "I'm not exactly a man of wealth or power," Tom continued, his tone honest and without a trace of self-pity. "Just a guy who tries to do the right thing. I fix things. That's what I've done my whole life. I fix what's broken." His words, simple yet sincere, hung in the air for a moment. There was something disarming about him, something that didn't match the scale of the accusations. No grandstanding, no bravado. Just a man in a worn jacket, speaking from the heart. Then, almost as an afterthought, Tom added, "I actually tried to fix the courthouse coffee machine once." He glanced sheepishly around the room. "Didn't go well. Think I made it worse, honestly. It's probably still broken." Laughter erupted, genuine, not mocking. Even Judge Caprio let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "That would explain the coffee I had this morning," he said with a smile. That single moment of levity transformed the atmosphere in the room. The courtroom, so often a stage for tension and drama, felt more human, more grounded. It was as if everyone collectively remembered that behind every case, every charge, there were people, flawed, funny, well-meaning people. Tom relaxed a little after that. The stiff posture gave way to something more natural. He folded his hands in front of him on the table, his fingers calloused and bearing the nicks and scars of a life spent working with tools. His face, too, told a story, sun-weathered and marked by years of labor, but not hardened. There was still a softness there, a sense of decency. The judge, ever the skilled reader of people, seemed to notice it too. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "you seem like a man who values integrity, but you understand the seriousness of the matter before us?" Tom nodded solemnly. "Yes, sir, I do. I know this isn't a joke. I know a lot of people think I did something wrong, and I'm here to explain my side. I'm not a lawyer, and I don't have fancy words, but I have the truth. That's all I've got." There was a quiet dignity in his words, a kind of courage that came not from defiance, but from an earnest belief in his own moral compass. He wasn't here to escape accountability. He was here to be understood. In the gallery, a woman leaned over to whisper to her friend, "That's the guy. He looks like someone's dad." Her friend nodded, still watching Tom with curiosity. There was a murmur of agreement throughout the back rows. The man accused of corporate fraud, environmental violations, or whatever the official charges entailed, did not match the mental picture anyone had brought with them. Meanwhile, at the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Lynn reviewed her notes with furrowed brows. She had prepared for a lengthy and technical opening, but already she sensed that this case wasn't going to follow the usual script. The human element, Tom's disarming humility, was going to be a factor. Judge Caprio signaled for the court to begin the formal proceedings, but not before offering one more word to the defendant. "Mr. Lawson," he said, "this court believes in fairness. We'll listen carefully to what you have to say, and we'll weigh every detail. You may not be a man of wealth or status, but your voice matters here. This is still a courtroom, not a boardroom." Tom nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'm ready." And with that, the courtroom settled into the rhythm of the trial. But the opening moments had already left their mark. In those first 3 minutes, the story had shifted, from numbers and allegations to character and credibility, from accusation to understanding. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was clear. Thomas Lawson was not just another name on a docket. He was a man with a story worth hearing. Judge Caprio began, "Mr. Lawson, this case concerns the accident on Lincoln Bridge last June. You were driving at an excessive speed, nearly causing a catastrophe, yes?" Thomas nodded soberly. "Yes, Your Honor, but I was rushing to help someone. A woman had fallen off the bridge railing. I had to act." The prosecutor leaned forward, voice sharp but measured. Mr. Lawson's speed was recorded at over 90 miles per hour in a 45 zone. His recklessness put dozens of lives at risk. Thomas sighed. "I understand that. I know what I did was dangerous, but I couldn't just stand by. She could have drowned." One juror whispered to another, the courtroom feeling the conflict between law and instinct. Judge Caprio interjected gently, "Mr. Lawson, sometimes the law asks us to balance what is right and what is necessary. Tell us exactly what happened that day." Thomas described the chaotic scene, the shriek of the woman, the horrified onlookers frozen in place, his own heartbeat pounding as he floored the gas to reach her before the emergency services arrived. His words painted a vivid picture, making the court feel the urgency, the raw human impulse to save a life. The courtroom, which had settled into a rhythm of legal formality, shifted once again as Thomas Lawson took a deep breath and leaned slightly forward in his chair. His hands, now unclasped, rested on the table, palms down as if steadying himself, not just for what he was about to say, but for the memories that were about to rise like a tide he could no longer hold back. "Your Honor," he began, his voice quieter now, almost reverent, "I've been turning this moment over in my head since the day it happened. Not just the charges, not just the panic, but why I reacted the way I did, why I didn't wait, why I crossed the line." There was no legal jargon in his tone, no scripted defense, just raw honesty. "I lost my daughter," Thomas said simply, and a hush fell over the room so thick it seemed to muffle even the city noise outside. The air felt still, as if the building itself was listening. It was 11 years ago. She was 10. He paused, his throat tightening. His eyes, once darting nervously around the room earlier in the day, now stared straight ahead, focused not on the judge, not on the prosecutor, but perhaps on some invisible place only he could see. "We were at the lake. It was just a regular Saturday. Sunny, kids laughing, families grilling hot dogs. The kind of day you think you'll remember as a happy one." He stopped again. A tear welled in the corner of his eye, and he blinked it back with practiced ease, though not quite successfully. "My daughter, Ellie," he said, her name spoken with the kind of fragile reverence one saves for sacred things. "She wandered into the deeper water when I was helping her little brother with his floaties. I looked away for maybe 30 seconds. When I turned back, she was struggling." Thomas's voice cracked, and for a moment, it looked like he might not be able to continue. But then he exhaled slowly and pressed on, as if he owed it to her to finish the story. "I ran. I screamed. I dove in. But it was too late. There was no lifeguard, no emergency personnel nearby, the help we needed. It just didn't come in time." A ripple of emotion spread through the courtroom. Jurors lowered their eyes. One wiped away a tear. Even Judge Caprio leaned back slightly, absorbing the gravity of Thomas's grief, like a weight pressing down on the room. "That kind of pain," Thomas continued, now speaking to the entire room, not just the judge, "it doesn't leave you. It changes you. It changes what you hear, what you see. You don't just remember it, you live with it. Every day." He turned then to the prosecutor's table. "So, when I saw that woman collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping, alone, her lips already turning blue, I didn't see a stranger. I saw my daughter. I saw Ellie." Silence, thick, reverent, and unbroken. "I didn't think. I couldn't think. I just acted. I broke into the building to get a defibrillator. I didn't know whose property it was, or that it was a restricted access zone, or that there were sensors and security protocols that would go haywire. I didn't care. All I knew was that someone needed help, and help wasn't coming fast enough. Just like that day at the lake." He looked down then, as if ashamed of his desperation. "Maybe I broke the law, but I did it because I knew what would happen if I didn't, and I couldn't lose another life." At that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom transformed. The initial image of Thomas Lawson, the handyman, the unlikely defendant, the man in jeans facing astronomical charges, was being reframed. He was now something far more complex, a father carrying the weight of a profound and private tragedy, one that had quietly informed every decision since. For several moments, no one spoke. Then, from the witness bench, a nurse stepped forward. Her name was Karen Morales, and she was called to testify about the events of the incident, the emergency response, the medical condition of the woman Thomas had helped, and the immediate aftermath. I arrived about 90 seconds after Mr. Lawson had already started chest compressions, she began, her voice clear and professional. We had been dispatched to a possible cardiac arrest in progress. When I got to the scene, I saw him there, sweating, kneeling, clearly exhausted, but performing CPR with impressive form. You don't always see that from civilians. She glanced over at Thomas, offering the smallest nod of recognition. We assessed the woman. Her name was Adrienne Bellamy. She had suffered a sudden cardiac arrhythmia. Without immediate intervention, she would have gone into full arrest. But because Mr. Lawson acted quickly and retrieved an AED from the adjacent building, we were able to stabilize her. Karen paused, then added firmly, "He saved her life." The prosecution didn't object. In fact, she said, directing her comments now to the jury, if he had waited even 2 minutes longer, if he had followed the proper chain of command, or waited for an official responder, Adrienne would likely have died. Sometimes saving a life doesn't come with a permit. It just comes with guts. Her testimony hit like a thunderclap. The legal technicalities that had once seemed central now felt peripheral. The question was no longer just what Thomas had done, but why. And in that space between action and intent, hearts were beginning to shift. The prosecutor, Rachel Lynn, who until then had maintained a composed and firm demeanor, let her pen rest gently on her notepad. Her expression was no longer rigid. Behind her dark eyes, you could see the wheels turning, calculating, reconsidering. The case, while still valid on the surface, had taken on a different emotional weight. The man before her was not a career criminal or a reckless saboteur. He was a grieving father who had made a decision in a moment of urgency, not for himself, but for a stranger. Back at the defense table, Thomas sat quietly, his gaze lowered. His knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of the table, not from fear, but from release. He had said the thing he'd kept inside for so long, and now that it was spoken, the burden was shared, at least in part. Judge Caprio took a moment to speak before moving to the next phase of the hearing. "Mr. Lawson," he said gently, "what you shared today took courage. Not only the actions you took that day, but the truth you've carried since then. This court does not turn a blind eye to protocol or property damage, but we also recognize that humanity does not always operate on a schedule. Sometimes, the right thing doesn't come with a rule book." Thomas nodded slowly, tears finally slipping down his cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. The judge turned to the jury box. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have heard not only the facts, but the heart of this case, and in this courtroom, both matter." With that, the proceedings paused for a short recess, but no one moved immediately. People sat in quiet reflection of lives lost, lives saved, and the unpredictable crossroads where the two often meet. And in the center of it, all sat Thomas Lawson, not a hero, not a criminal, but a man who simply refused to let someone else die the way his daughter had. Judge Caprio paused, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the case. The law is clear to protect society from reckless acts, yet it also recognizes the complexity of human decisions under pressure. He leaned forward, voice warm but firm. "Mr. Lawson, your intentions were noble, but the risk was immense. Justice isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding." He reflected aloud on the thin line between heroism and recklessness. When does saving a life become a danger to many? That question lies at the heart of this case. The courtroom lights flickered once before steadying again, almost as if the building itself could sense that something was shifting. The earlier emotional testimony had already altered the energy in the room, but now the defense was ready to deliver something no one had expected, new evidence that had the potential to fundamentally alter the entire trajectory of the trial. "Your Honor," said Emily Grant, Thomas Lawson's defense attorney, rising to her feet with a composed urgency, "with the court's permission, we would like to submit a newly recovered surveillance video from a nearby security system that was not previously included in the initial discovery due to a clerical error at the Municipal Records Office." Judge Caprio raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on, Ms. Grant." This footage captures the events leading up to and following the medical emergency involving Ms. Adrienne Bellamy. "We believe it is crucial for the jury to see what actually happened, not just to Mr. Lawson, but to the environment around him during those critical moments." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor's brow furrowed. She had been made aware of potential new footage in the prior week, but it had arrived late and unverified. Now it was ready to be shown. "Proceed," the judge said with a nod. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the large flat-screen monitor flickered to life. The room fell silent. The footage opened with a wide-angle shot from a building across the street. The timestamp ran in the bottom corner, 2:47 p.m. The heat shimmered slightly on the pavement. Then, the camera zoomed in, likely automated or motion-triggered, capturing the exact moment that Adrienne Bellamy collapsed. She was walking briskly near the edge of the public fountain area, staggered, then suddenly dropped to her knees and fell forward. No one was near her. No passerby immediately reacted. She was completely alone. The footage then jumped to Thomas Lawson, clearly identifiable even from the grainy angle, running from the corner of the block. His stride was quick, almost desperate. He stopped only momentarily at the woman's side, then bolted toward a locked utility access door on the adjacent building. A few bystanders appeared, confused, some pointing, some yelling. Then came the part that pulled a gasp from the courtroom. A split screen appeared, showing footage from a dispatch center that had just been synchronized with the surveillance video. The court could now see the 911 system dashboard, calls stacking up, confusion about the incident location, and most telling of all, a delay. At 2:48 p.m., dispatch relayed the call to the wrong emergency unit. The GPS coordinates were off by nearly a full block. 2 separate ambulances were dispatched, one to the park, one to the courthouse side entrance. Neither was directly routed to where Adrienne lay. Dispatch didn't correct the mistake until 2:53 p.m. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and audible reactions. Attorney Grant turned to the jury. "You've heard Mr. Lawson's account. You've heard testimony that he acted out of instinct, out of pain, out of humanity. But now you see what he saw. A woman dying, alone, and no help in sight. In that moment, he was the emergency response." The judge signaled for order, but the moment hung there, heavy, transformative. Even the prosecutor, Rachel Lynn, was visibly affected, her once confident posture now bent slightly in thought. Then came the testimony of Dr. Evan Rosenthal, a forensic emergency medicine expert brought in by the defense. He was a calm man with gray hair and precise language, the kind of expert you trusted the moment he started speaking. "I've reviewed the footage, the timestamps, and Ms. Bellamy's medical file," he began. "She experienced what we refer to as ventricular fibrillation, or VFIB. In cases like these, every second counts, literally." He turned to the jury, making eye contact. VFib disrupts the heart's electrical system, causing it to flutter rather than pump. Once this starts, The body begins to shut down immediately. Brain damage can begin within 4 minutes. Death often occurs within 6 to 8 minutes if no intervention is made. He tapped the screen with a small laser pointer. Mr. Lawson administered the first defibrillation shock at approximately 4 minutes and 15 seconds after the collapse. Paramedics arrived just under 10 minutes in. Had Mr. Lawson waited for them, she would almost certainly have died, not because emergency services were negligent, but because miscommunication and geography introduced a fatal delay. There it was, the turning point. For hours, the court had heard about trespassing, property violations, disruption of municipal infrastructure, and the unauthorized use of emergency equipment. But now, all of that felt like background noise to a much simpler truth. Thomas had saved a life because no one else had arrived in time. Judge Caprio looked up from his notes. "Dr. Rosenthal, to be clear, are you saying that Mr. Lawson's rapid action was the decisive factor in Ms. Bellamy's survival?" The doctor didn't hesitate. "Yes, Your Honor. His speed, while unorthodox, was not only appropriate, it was critical." The judge nodded thoughtfully and then glanced toward the jury. Some were scribbling notes furiously. Others just stared at the screen, stunned. Prosecutor Lynn stood slowly, signaling that she would not object to the footage or the testimony. Instead, she addressed the room with a rare moment of vulnerability. "I believe in the law," she said. "I believe in its structure and the need for order. But I also believe in context. The evidence presented here today shows that Mr. Lawson did not act out of recklessness, but out of necessity, and out of compassion." It wasn't a concession, but it was close. Thomas, who had remained quiet during the entire presentation, wiped his palms on his jeans and looked down. He wasn't triumphant. He wasn't even relieved. He was just quiet, perhaps even haunted. As though seeing it all again, the collapse, the chaos, the panic, had transported him back to that day, both the day of the rescue and the day at the lake with Ellie. Judge Caprio spoke once more before concluding the segment. "This court values truth," he said, "and what we've seen here today is truth not just in testimony, but in action. Mr. Lawson, you may have violated a statute, but you did not violate the spirit of decency. The evidence shows that in a moment when time could not afford hesitation, you chose to act." The session was adjourned for the day. As people stood to leave, the atmosphere was no longer one of prosecution versus defense. It had shifted to something far more profound, a shared realization that laws are meant to protect life, and sometimes that means knowing when to break them to uphold their very purpose. In that courtroom, justice had stopped being about rules and started being about humanity. The courtroom had rarely felt this still. After the presentation of the surveillance footage and the expert testimony, it was as if the air itself had thickened with meaning. The jury sat quietly in their box, some visibly moved, some lost in thought. The gallery, once buzzing with quiet judgment and speculation, had grown reverent, hushed by the weight of what they had just seen and heard. And at the center of it all sat Judge Frank Caprio. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he regarded Thomas Lawson for a long moment, his expression unreadable, but softened by something more than just legal understanding, something deeply human. Thomas, still seated at the defendant's table, seemed smaller than before, not diminished, but humbled. His hands trembled faintly in his lap, his eyes rimmed with unshed tears. For all his earlier resolve and dignity, it was clear that this moment, the wait for final judgment, was nearly unbearable. Finally, Judge Caprio leaned forward. "Mr. Lawson," he said, his voice low, steady, and tinged with emotion, "the law, in its purest form, is not just a collection of rules and punishments. It is a framework meant to guide us toward justice, toward compassion, toward the kind of society we all want to live in. He paused and looked around the room, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom, from the jury to the lawyers to the spectators in the back rows. The law you broke, entering restricted property, triggering a municipal emergency system, damaging government equipment, is clear. There are statutes on the books for a reason. And when we allow personal decisions to override law without consequence, we risk opening dangerous doors. Thomas lowered his head. The truth of those words was not lost on him. But, Judge Caprio continued, we must also ask, what is the law for, if not to protect life, to uphold decency, to preserve not just order, but humanity? The judge's voice softened, warm but commanding. Your actions, Mr. Lawson, while against the letter of the law, reflect a profound human courage. You acted not out of self-interest, not out of carelessness or rebellion, but out of instinct to save a life. You saw a dying woman and remembered your daughter, not because you wanted to break the rules, but because you could not bear to see another life slip away, while help waited behind a bureaucratic misstep. The room seemed to lean in, as though the very walls had ears. Judge Caprio glanced toward the prosecution table. Rachel Lynn, the assistant district attorney who had opened the case with determined professionalism, now nodded slightly, acknowledging not defeat, but agreement. We cannot ignore the damage caused, Caprio continued. The security system was compromised. Resources were diverted. You entered a restricted space without authorization. And yes, the total financial implication, if measured strictly, would reach into the hundreds of millions when including citywide disruptions. He reached for his gavel, then stopped. I will fine you $200 million. Gasps echoed around the room. Even Thomas looked up, stunned. His mouth parted in disbelief, but he said nothing. The judge let the weight of the words settle, then leaned forward once more. But I will also suspend the majority of this fine, he said, his tone resolute, under one condition. The room, collectively breathless, waited. That you, Mr. Lawson, dedicate yourself to teaching others about what you did, not to glorify it, but to educate, to speak at schools, at EMT training centers, at public safety forums, that you help people understand the difference between impulsiveness and moral courage, between breaking the law for convenience and breaking it when humanity leaves you no choice. A murmur of understanding spread across the room. I want you, Caprio added, to tell your story, Ellie's story. Let the memory of your daughter be a guide for others. Let this courtroom moment become a moment of learning for our city. If even one person makes the right call in a future crisis because of your voice, then your actions will have saved more than just one life. Tears finally escaped down Thomas's cheeks. He didn't bother to hide them. He didn't feel shame anymore, only a deep, overwhelming gratitude. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice cracking. I will. Judge Caprio gave a small, almost fatherly nod. Then this court finds resolution not only in law, but in justice. He struck the gavel softly, more symbolic than severe. A long, collective exhale passed through the courtroom. It was as if the entire room had been holding its breath, waiting to see whether mercy would find its place alongside accountability. And now, it had. Rachel Lynn stood. The state accepts this resolution, Your Honor, she said, and we support the court's decision to create a path toward education and healing. As people began to rise, Thomas remained seated, overcome. Emily Grant, his attorney, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It's over, she whispered. You did it. He looked up through tears and offered a small, exhausted smile. A reporter at the back whispered into a recorder, Thomas Lawson walks out not a criminal, but a teacher, a man who broke a rule to preserve a life, and whose sentence is now to ensure others know when to do the same. As the courtroom emptied, people approached Thomas, not as jurors or observers or lawyers, but as people. One shook his hand, another gave a quiet nod of respect. Someone else simply said, "Thank you." Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long golden shadows through the tall courthouse windows. The day had begun with accusation, tension, and the specter of a financial penalty no ordinary man could bear. But it ended with something far more profound: redemption, education, and a shared acknowledgement that courage, real courage, is often quiet, uncertain, and messy, but undeniably human. Thomas Lawson walked out of the courtroom, not exonerated in the traditional sense, but vindicated in the eyes of justice. Not because he had followed every rule, but because he had remembered something more important: why the rules exist at all. And now, his mission was clear: not to forget the pain of the past, but to use it. To teach others that in a world of hesitation, doing something could mean the difference between tragedy and hope. That day, inside a modest courtroom tucked within the heart of the city, something remarkable happened. It wasn't the kind of event captured in law school textbooks or bound in pages of precedent. It wasn't dramatic in the way of shouting lawyers or grandstanding witnesses. There were no cinematic revelations, no secret documents pulled at the 11th hour. What happened was something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. A man stood before the court, not to excuse his actions, but to explain them. A judge listened, not just to the facts, but to the pain behind them. A prosecutor, trained to build ironclad cases, chose to acknowledge something larger than legality. And in that fragile, courageous exchange between rules and reality, justice found a new shape. That shape was compassion. Thomas Lawson's case had begun as a procedural spectacle, an unassuming handyman facing a staggering $200 million fine. His crime? Breaking into a municipal utility space to retrieve a life-saving defibrillator for a woman who had collapsed outside a government building. On paper, it was clear-cut: unauthorized entry, interference with emergency infrastructure, and city-wide procedural disruption. On paper, Thomas looked guilty. But justice, as the world would be reminded that day, does not live on paper alone. It breathes, it listens. It weighs not only what is legal, but what is right. And sometimes, just sometimes, it surprises. The courtroom learned that Thomas had not acted recklessly or selfishly. He had acted because grief had taught him what it means to lose someone while waiting for help that never came. He had once watched his 10-year-old daughter slip beneath the surface of a quiet lake. He had screamed. He had dove in. But help had arrived too late. That pain, still etched into every line of his face, had shaped his decision years later when he saw a stranger collapse and gasped for air on a summer sidewalk. In that moment, he didn't see a legal boundary. He saw a second chance. And when Judge Caprio finally rendered his decision, it reflected more than jurisprudence. It reflected humanity. "I will fine you $200 million, the judge had said, allowing the courtroom to tremble for just a moment in disbelief. Then, without pause, he added, "But I will also suspend the majority of this fine under one condition: that you dedicate yourself to teaching others about the risks and rewards of courage in crisis." It was a sentence not of punishment, but of purpose, and it rippled far beyond the walls of that courtroom. Thomas's story was picked up by local news first, then regional networks, and soon national headlines. Not because of the fine, but because of the message: that courage often defies procedure, and that when weighed with care, the law can flex, gracefully, to accommodate the strength of the human heart. In the weeks that followed, Thomas received letters from around the country. First responders wrote to thank him for reminding people what it means to act in the face of uncertainty. Parents wrote to share their own stories of loss and second chances. Teachers invited him to speak to students about real-world ethics. City councils requested his presence at public safety seminars. And Thomas, true to his word, answered every call. His first talk was at a local EMT training center, where he stood nervously before a room of young cadets. He brought no prepared speech, no visual aids, just a photo of his daughter, Ellie, and the quiet resolve of someone who had been through fire and come out not hardened, but forged. "I'm not here to tell you to break the rules," he said that day. "I'm here to tell you that sometimes, in moments of crisis, you'll have to make a call no one trained you for. And when that moment comes, you'll need to know the difference between fear and conscience." He became, as Judge Caprio had envisioned, not a criminal with a suspended fine, but a mentor. A reluctant public figure whose story reminded others that even in a world governed by order, there must be space for grace. Back at the courthouse, Judge Caprio continued to preside over his docket, but he too had changed. In interviews, he spoke candidly about the case. "We often say justice is blind," he noted, "but I don't believe that's quite right. True justice sees deeply. It sees the person behind the act. It understands the story behind the statute. And in this courtroom, justice does not simply punish, it listens, it learns, and, when necessary, it forgives." Prosecutor Rachel Lynn, once cast in the role of antagonist, publicly supported the outcome. "Mr. Lawson reminded us all that there's a time for rules, and a time for humanity," she said. "I'm proud of our legal system for finding the balance that day." As for Adrienne Bellamy, the woman whose life Thomas saved, she recovered fully. Weeks later, she stood beside him during one of his public talks. She didn't say much, just this: "Thomas didn't save me instead of obeying the law. He saved me because he couldn't wait, and I'm here because of that choice." In that courtroom, and far beyond it, Thomas's story became a quiet kind of legend, not because it was flashy or dramatic, but because it reminded people of something we often forget. Laws are made by humans, for humans. And sometimes, when a law is bent not out of defiance, but out of love, something greater is upheld. That day, the courtroom didn't just render a verdict, it rendered a truth. That justice is not deaf to pain, that it is not blind to compassion, that it carries in each hand not only the scales, but also the capacity to understand. Thomas Lawson had walked into the courtroom facing a staggering fine, a seemingly impossible judgment, and a future that looked bleak. But he walked out carrying something different: a mission, a voice, and the knowledge that sometimes the right thing is not the easy thing. And in Judge Caprio's courtroom, the world saw proof that justice can bend, not to weakness, not to favoritism, but to the enduring strength of the human heart. If this story touched you, share where you're watching from in the comments. What would you have done in Mr. Lawson's place? Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss the next story where justice meets humanity. Thank you for being part of this courtroom family.